Welcome back to Being the Best Version of Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Heller. Today, we have an awesome guest, Dr. Savannah. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure getting to chat. My name is Dr. Savannah Forry. I am an occupational therapist and I am currently in Los Angeles, California.
Welcome. Happy to have you on the podcast.
Thanks.
All right. So today we have a really fun topic. We're going to talk about executive functioning, ADHD, and sports. So before we dive right in, a lot of times people talk about the term executive functioning, but a lot of times they don't really take the time to actually look at what does it actually mean. So could you tell us a little bit about what executive functioning is and some of the ways that you feel like it's relevant to sports?
Definitely. Executive functioning is really the basis for a lot of those higher level thoughts and more sophisticated behaviors we're looking for just as a human species. So essentially, it is a set of mental skills that helps you plan, organize, focus, remember, manage emotions, and adjust in real time throughout your day. And so it's a combination and a coordination of all of those different facets and elements of your brain that allows you to have this goal directed behavior to execute something that you put your mind to. And so that really applies to sports for a lot of different reasons, right? When we're playing a sport, things are moving very quickly. You're having to multitask, remember a plan, know who's around you, be thinking of the next step, all while consciously being in the moment to attend to what might be happening next. So executive functioning is a big characteristic of, I think, sports performance that is probably a little undervalued, if you ask me.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks for explaining executive functioning in connection to sports. And I think what you've really hit on is the fact that it really is vital to sports, yet it's not something a lot of people think about. They think about, depending on the sport, how well can you kick the ball? Thinking about, baseball, pitching and catching. And again, those are all fundamentals are all really important for sports. But the mental piece is really crucial as well. And, if you have a hard time with focus to begin with, that can, certainly add to it. So there's a lot of different sort of pieces to it. And so, like, in your practice, what are some of the things that you work on with kids and teens around executive functioning in sports?
Definitely. I think it's a sequencing of thought processes, right? Sometimes I work with a lot of student athletes who get maybe a couple steps ahead, and sometimes that can create anxiety, or sometimes that can create even some low mood or some apprehension and fearfulness. So I try to bring my clients back to kind of that present moment of the adapting and the planning as opposed to getting ahead with overvaluing alternative outcomes that could happen. We'll say that.
And as part of that, do you deal a lot with people that get very overwhelmed by their emotions during a game?
Most definitely. There is a really strong correlation between emotional regulation and coordinating a lot of those thinking skills that we like to talk about. So I am always considering how those two interplay with each other because they inform and also support one another. And so I'm always looking at both pieces of that information to support a student and an athlete to be able to execute a plan. And so I'm looking at, do those two things work well together? Maybe which one is less evolved in their skill set? And are there any strategies we can use to kind of fill in the gaps so that those two things have a little bit more balance so that they are playing into each other as opposed to against each other? No pun intended.
Yeah. And, like, let's say for people listening that have a child that maybe has a low frustration tolerance and gets upset easily during games, like let's say, the referee or the umpire, makes a call that they perceive as not being fair or some, I don't know, it's for example, in baseball, maybe they say it's a strike when, the child thinks, oh, it's definitely a ball. Or I don't know, in basketball, the referee calls a foul that the child thinks, oh, that was definitely not a foul. Like any like quick strategies that you would often recommend that kids could use, in those kinds of situations, like as a way to kind of reset things.
Yeah. I got to go with my tried and true of a deep breath. I know it sounds so cliche and so woo-woo, but I love talking about deep breathing, especially for young student athletes, because it is a skill that carries you through adulthood. And I think what's so valuable about a deep breath is there's a lot of different benefits to it. One, you get a lot of oxygen to your body and your brain, which is necessary and never a bad thing. Two, it also allows you to take a pause so that way you're not letting your emotions overtake the situation. You're allowed to be frustrated and mad and sad and disappointed and all those different things. But I think what gets carried away is then the behavior that comes after that. And it can be a little impulsive or reactive at times. And so taking a deep breath gives you a moment to pause and intentionally respond as opposed to kind of reacting to just the emotion that came up. And then the third thing that I really think you can benefit from when taking a deep breath is the ability to stimulate your vagus nerve. And so that is the nerve that's responsible for helping your nervous system calm down, specifically your parasympathetic nervous system. And so when you take a deep breath, your lungs actually expand low into more of like the stomach area and kind of take up that extra space at the bottom of your rib cage. And so by doing that, they press on your vagus nerve, which sends a signal all the way back up to your head that says, they're taking a deep breath. I must be okay. And it kind of re-engages and rechecks your emotions. So I know a deep breath is probably something everybody is going to tell you, but those are kind of the reasons that I like to share and the science behind why it is one of the most effective strategies to use in those situations.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's really helpful to hear the science behind it because, yeah, I think, someone saying, oh, take a deep breath. I think in theory, like it's a common thing, but I think people don't often realize why it's helpful. And I would also imagine that, well, obviously you can take a deep breath in a couple different ways, different breathing exercise like box breathing or certain other ones, depending on circumstances, may have different, values to a person in a given situation.
Most definitely. And then I think it also then leads to maybe the second thing I would suggest, which is naming the emotion. I think sometimes when we feel things very strongly, we go into, again, more of a activated or reactive state to where our emotions can sometimes feel bigger than they are or proportionally need to be for their situation. And so sometimes even just by labeling the emotion kind of re-engages that thinking part of your brain to check back in with, oh yeah, what am I actually feeling? Instead of just an activation that kind of comes out of nowhere and feels a little out of control at times.
And that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think emotion regulation certainly is definitely really crucial. And I think you gave some great strategies for people on how to work on that. I know with executive functioning for kids or teens have a hard time with it. One of the other challenges I often see are challenges with practice. So following directions, not knowing what to do. And then sometimes that does create an emotional response, either to avoid something, an activity because they don't know what they're doing, or just they kind of look like they're sort of, deer in the headlights, not sure what's going on. What kind of stuff would you recommend for someone that, let's just say, I don't know, like a middle schooler or high schooler that just, still has a hard time kind of following directions of practice? And it's not because they don't care, but that they have a hard time with the multi-step directions and things like that.
Definitely. I think as an occupational therapist, I am always looking at the environment and the maybe social interaction and the maybe distraction that takes place in those kinds of situations. So some of the strategies I would suggest in that regard is maybe moving to the front of the group. So that way there's less visual distraction around you and you really can see and visualize and maybe even feel more of the emotion when the directive is being told. That can a lot of times help engage attention and focus and then again apply for the working memory component of executive functioning when it comes to be your turn to do that drill. Something else I would maybe suggest is something like chewing gum. If that's allowed in the sport and that's safe to do so, chewing gum is a proprioceptive tool. And so it's kind of like a fidget spinner for your mouth, so to speak. So similar to how fidget spinners, the inception was really to help people who have that extra attentional energy, put it somewhere that's not a distraction to the overall goal. And so gum can kind of be that fidget spinner during practice when there is maybe moments of extra energy or there is a need to be extra focused. Sometimes kids might be looking for a place to put those extra thoughts or that extra energy. And so gum a lot of times can be that outlet for them to then focus on the overall goal and the overall directive they're actually trying to receive from a coach.
No, I think it's a really great idea. Because I think one of the things I think you're getting at with this, and I don't know, I'm a big proponent of the idea of harnessing fidgeting to improve focus. And so using, fidgets or something like it in kind of a controlled, mindless way to be able to, essentially be more stimulated or engage in a situation to in turn be able to focus better. I mean, those can actually work right on the sidelines as well. As if you have, if you're a coach, you have kids that have a hard time sitting still or paying attention, pass out fidgets on the bench and, kids can kind of stay seated, fiddle with them while they watch the game. if they're not in at the time.
Definitely. And I think another element that that touches on is it gives busy hands and maybe busy minds a job. We like predictability. We like purpose. When it's very clear what's expected from us, it's a little easier to deliver on that. And so if in the example that you're giving with the sideline, sure, maybe it is hard to pay attention when you're not physically involved in the situation, but having a job like, hey, I need you to make sure if the ball goes out of bounds, you can get it for us. Or I need you to sit right next to me on the bench and hold the whiteboard. I need you to, pass out the fidget spinners when the next person comes on the bench and sits next to you. I think a job is also something that can create a lot of meaning for those individuals who might not get as much playing time. And it also makes them feel like they are, again, a part of the team and has an outlet for maybe the busier hands or the busier minds.
It's a great suggestion for games. And I think certainly you could apply the same strategy to practices that, having a child that, especially because a lot of kids with executive functioning challenges often have a hard time with transitions, kind of going from one activity to the next. So giving them a job to maybe you ask them to pass out cones for the next activity or help set up something that can often, give them a task to do, especially if during the downtime, they're more likely to have a hard time with transition that, keeps them occupied.
Most definitely. And I think transitions are one of the hardest executive functioning coordination efforts that we have to make throughout the day. I think there is a lot of energy that can be spent either strategically or I want to say maybe like wasted in a transition that I think a lot of people, especially with executive functioning challenges or dysfunction, get kind of stuck or sticky in, which can also lead to dysregulation. And then it's kind of a cycle that just repeats itself, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is, if you have a bunch of kids at practice and you're trying to move from one activity to the next, and you've got, let's say it's basketball, a couple of kids kind of shooting basketballs instead of doing what they're supposed to do, or soccer, running around, kicking a ball, playing around instead of getting ready for the next activity, that really derails the whole team. And then you don't cover as much, kids get annoyed, and then you're trying to, get kids to do the next activity, and then other kids get bored of waiting and then start doing something else sometimes. So the idea is this kind of stuff. It's not just the child is having a hard time, but it often can really impact the whole team. I mean, one of the things with that I found helpful is sometimes, there are a couple of things. I mean, one, like, is for someone to take a step back to look at, what's going on. So let's say there's an issue of transition. So to look at what's going on. What are kids doing? What do they have access to? I mean, like with basketball, for example, if let's say the most common thing kids do when they have a hard time transitioning is they grab their basketball and go start dribbling or shooting. If you collect all the balls at the beginning of practice, basically put them in a bag, and then you just hand them out, for the times kids need their own ball, then basically you've taken away the stimulus that they're using that derails them. And so they're more likely to sort of stay focused and not get into stuff, and then make it a little bit easier to transition from one thing to the next. Or you can do the same thing with, let's say, stretching. Like stretching, obviously a lot of teams stretch in a variety of sports. And so if kids have a hard time, like let's say being in a circle or being in a group, if it's not very organized, having them all stretch on a line, whether it's the first baseline or a line on a basketball court or on a soccer field, basically it gives them a stationary point to line up with. And so it can help keep them sort of a little bit more in line, and no pun intended, and in turn be able to sort of focus better. So again, there's like little things you can do, but I think it's really the matter of taking that time to actually take a step back and look at it and see. And again, whether you're the coach or whether you're a parent watching your child at practice, seeing all these things unfolding in real time, being able to take a step back to analyze the situation, figure out what can we do to make things better can often go a long way. Because a lot of it also is, I see a lot of times where kids, especially ADHD, will sometimes quit sports very prematurely, not because they don't like the sport, but because of the fact that, they have a hard time with following the directions of practice, or they get frustrated easily. And so being able to really address all this stuff can really help kids to thrive in sports and really give it their all to get the full benefit out of it that they don't get if they quit because they can't handle the frustration or trouble following directions.
Right. And I think a lot of times those kids are labeled as, quote unquote bad. And I think that's such a misrepresentation of the actual reality of the situation. You have kids, you have individuals who need extra supports to help their brain operate in a system that's maybe not meant for how their brain is patterned right now. And so to not maybe take a step back and evaluate the other components of the situation, not just the child's behavior or, presentation of motivation. They might really want to be there, but their brain is just having a really hard time coordinating the emotional centers and the maybe impulse control to be able to execute what's being asked of them, because it's a very complicated process to coordinate all of those systems, and we kind of take it for granted a lot of times.
Huh. Well, and people that you work with, do you often recommend that the parents, or if the person's old enough themselves, that they talk to their coach in a sport and explain, this is where I have trouble with? Like, do you feel like that having the open communication can often be helpful?
Most definitely. I will speak from experience on that one. I felt like I've always learned very differently. And so in sports, I found myself being that kid who was kind of lost in drills and having a hard time paying attention, not because I didn't want to, but because I genuinely was trying to process all the information being told to me.
Can be helpful to talk to the coach directly, either for the child themselves or for the parents, if the child has executive function weaknesses or ADHD, to let the coach know, sort of how they learn, or that this is a challenge, so that potentially the coach can be more supportive and help them.
Yes, I think it's most definitely important to share some of the learning differences. And I'll say, speaking from experience, I'm someone who felt like I learned differently. And so being able to, one, understand my own learning process and then be able to advocate and share that with a coach to say, I'm sorry, I'm not making eye contact because I don't care. I'm looking at the floor because I'm trying to process the information. So that simple communication can take a coach's perspective of an athlete and say, okay, this is an athlete who doesn't care, they're not making eye contact with me, to, oh, wow, she's not making eye contact with me. She must really be listening and care what I have to say. So I think simple advocacy and communication with a coach who's trying to maybe instruct or teach or help an individual or a kid learn can be very, very effective for both parties and just really enhance the overall learning experience. So I highly recommend, if you feel like you know where your learning gaps are, or you feel like you can identify where the sticky parts are for you, I highly, highly encourage being able to communicate that, or at least having a conversation about, this is what's happening for me. Do you have any strategies? Because it might not be the first time a coach has come across that either.
Right, no, exactly. And so I think in most cases, I think having the open communication can make a huge difference, because, I mean, from a practical standpoint, if you have a child that's, they are not really, doesn't look like they're paying attention, the coach may assume, oh, the child just doesn't want to be here and their parents signed them up and are making them come. And so they may treat the child a little bit differently. But if it turns out that they actually genuinely care, and, the reason that they're, sitting on the ground, I don't know, digging in the dirt or something, is because they have a hard time with focus, that's very different. And so the coach is probably going to make more of an effort to try to help the child. And the more information they have, especially if the coach is willing to take the time to support kids beyond just running drills, the child can probably get a lot more out of that experience. I mean, because even it's one of those things where I think a lot of the strategies that a coach could use that benefit kids with ADHD, executive function challenges, in most cases really benefit all kids. I mean, so for example, if kids do better with visual instructions, having a whiteboard, where basically you have the agenda for practice on the whiteboard. You have visual representations of each drill. So in addition to talking through it, because also in most cases, if coaches give a lot of verbal instructions, kids are going to lose focus very easily, with ADHD or not, especially younger kids. And so keeping verbal instructions really short, having a whiteboard to illustrate things visually can really help. Having players demonstrate what to do can also really help a lot, because I think seeing stuff visually is one really great way that really can help kids to better understand what to do more quickly. So I think those things, certainly can help a lot in that kind of situation. And also just sometimes even asking the parents, especially the parents willing to be open to say, what works for your child at school or at home in X, Y, or Z situation. Because I think it can often then, create, by having that open communication, really can help a lot towards kids, being able to be more supported by their coach and, even by the parents as well in sport.
And then the byproduct of that is the kid feels better and the parent feels better, because everybody's feeling like they're understood and valued and can express themselves and participate in the ways that are effective for them, which then leads to a higher self-confidence and higher self-efficacy, which then helps persistence and resilience. So it's kind of like that domino effect. By just having communication and maybe tolerance or understanding, or an openness to understanding that some people's brains might just operate a little bit differently, and then their behavior might look a little different, and that's not because they don't care, but it's because they're just needing a couple extra supports that, like you said, genuinely could probably help the entire team.
Exactly. Because I think a lot of times, parents will think about, let's say in school, talking to the teacher if the child's having trouble, or getting formal accommodation set up. But I think in a lot of cases outside of school, a lot of parents don't really think about, how can my child be supported? And again, this probably goes beyond sports too, in terms of, I don't know, let's say someone with a music lesson or music class, that there could be times where, some of these same types of strategies may be helpful for extracurricular activities that are not sports related as well. But if you don't really help your child to advocate, and again, you don't always have to necessarily disclose that it's a formal disability or anything. It can be just to say, I have a hard time with X, Y, or Z, not label it necessarily. And in a lot of cases, also for kids with ADHD, if they don't really want to disclose that specifically, just saying you have weaknesses in executive functioning is kind of a nice way of saying that without offering any sort of formal diagnosis.
Most definitely. And I would say most coaches don't need to know. All they really need to know is that you're experiencing or having a challenge in one area and they're just needing some understanding. I think the specifics are, yes, valuable, but not always necessary to still communicating the same uh, or getting the same outcome.
Right, exactly. That it's about understanding the information, not about the label that to determine, how the coach, can best help a player.
Most definitely. Yeah.
And what would you recommend if, let's say you have, I don't know, let's say I don't know, a third, fourth grader, somewhere around there, that maybe just, even they've been playing a sport for a while, just really don't understand a lot of the specifics of how different positions work together and things like that. Because like that obviously can be impacted a lot with executive function if you don't really understand how like, your positions you play relate to whether it's soccer or basketball or baseball, positions obviously all fit together in different ways. What kind of stuff do you recommend or do you work on with kids to help with that piece, like the visual planning, like for understanding the different parts of, different positions and how that fits with other positions in a sport?
I think a good starting place, and this might be my OT roots, but I am very invested in what the kid is invested in. And so I've had lots of different kids who are very interested in Minecraft or they are very interested in Pokemon. And so I try to use those concepts that are very intuitive for that kid and that are very meaningful for that kid. And I try to make or establish relationships and kind of connect the dots between the elements that they're already really invested in to help kind of link the learning to something that is maybe a little more novel or misunderstood by them. So I try to use their strengths and their interests to teach them something new or novel and really try to capitalize on the established brain pathways that they're already working with.
Yeah, well, that's great advice. I think that can definitely help a lot. And again, I think there's a lot that parents can do at home in terms of the idea of creating like visual things for the child. And again, using stuff that they like doing. I mean, you can do it with action figures, lots of, do with puppets, basically, running through kind of, or even, chess pieces, putting, different things to sort of represent different positions in a sport. And I
Mo-
think just because, that and also even like watching the sport with your child, whether it's a live game of some kind or on TV and like asking questions, talking through it, I think you can often get a very different perspective, being able to see it outside of yourself that you don't really get when you're actually in the moment playing the sport yourself.
Most definitely. I think the visuals are really key for this population in terms of being able to process information. So I love the idea of picking a player on TV and following them for a couple games and watching where they are on the field and even maybe drawing them out together and recreating things in addition to watching what's already established on TV that can also really strengthen the learning and the memory of learning those new positions not just watching what's already out there, but also then recreating it on a piece of paper from memory.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, even using, depending on the sport, like one of the like a basketball board or a baseball where you have kind of the magnets and you kind of move different positions around, because I think that also can, especially if you can then understand what that really represents, can be another way visually to help understand. Because this is also one of the things I see quite a bit, especially people I work with that play basketball, is the fact that trying to memorize plays, especially for older kids, high school, a lot of that's one of the things where a lot of kids or teens with executive functioning issues have a real hard time is memorizing plays and they get very confused and so really like walking through stuff, having the visual thing where they actually see it and move to different steps on a board can often help a lot with that.
Most definitely. I also like to suggest creating your own names for positions or creating your own names for plays. Sometimes that can make things stick a little bit easier and even using mnemonics or different like stories that you come up with. Sometimes the ADHD brain can be very creative and can be very artistic. And so that's another way you can capitalize on those natural strengths.
Exactly. And I think trying to capitalize on the strengths is definitely important in all of this.
That is the name of the game. Most definitely. Yeah.
And if you could give sort of, one piece of advice to coaches and one piece of advice to parents around supporting kids with executive function challenges, what would that advice be?
Ooh, it's hard to wrap it up with a bow with one piece of advice.
You can do two if you want.
Yeah, I would say don't ignore the emotions within and Don't ignore the emotions and their role in executive functioning. It's not just the thinking, there's also the feeling that goes along with it. And there's a bidirectional relationship between the two. So I think don't overlook emotions and their role in executive functioning. And so that might look like even having talks after practice or even debriefing. Hey, how did that feel for you? As opposed to telling a kid how something went, being open to receiving maybe their emotional experience and hearing about it and just accepting it for what it is without any negotiation. I'd say that's probably my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is probably planning ahead as much as you can. And being able to help kids anticipate so that they are able to make those modifications in practice in real time. Hey, remember last time you had a hard time hearing and paying attention when coach talked? Maybe tonight you could try to find a spot up front to see if that would help your brain focus a little bit more. So even having these conversations outwardly ahead of time so that kids are learning these adaptive strategies and being able to implement and think about them on their own in less intensive times as opposed to like right before the game or like right after the game or during the practice, being able to have a plan and talk about these things ahead of time when your brain is maybe more ready to receive the information and process the information can help them the application in real time. So that's something else I would maybe throw out there.
Okay, great. No, that's definitely good advice. And I think something just made me think of that you mentioned or sort of allude to a little bit is this idea of kind of playing ahead. And I think in the same way that, parents can help their kids with playing ahead for stuff in practice, coaches can sort of do the same thing. And that the idea that, if you come up with, an activity to do, it may look great on paper, but doesn't mean it's going to always work super well. And again, sometimes there's trial and error, but, being able to actually like try out the activities yourself if you can ahead of time to have a sense of what it's like gives you more of a sense of how is the child likely to experience it. Is this going to be really confusing when you're actually doing it? Does it seem a lot harder than it looks? Because that can also really help then to make sure that whatever you're setting for practice is more realistic and is more likely to sort of go well and be helpful.
And I think that's what makes the good coaches great is when you're able to put yourself in the kid's shoes or the individual shoes and be open to changing the plan and adapting and creating different supports so that the kids are able to follow along and it's more of a system that works for them as opposed to a demand that might be a little out of their capacity.
I think there's a lot of good things that came out today that I think a lot of listeners hopefully will be able to really benefit from. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Yes, I am accepting clients in California, so you can learn more about me and my occupational therapy practice at scholarathlete.society.com. I'm also on Instagram, so my handle is at scholarathlete.society. I'm always sharing information on there. I am always open to conversation, so looking forward to you connecting and hopefully this was helpful.
Oh, well, great. And I'll make sure to get all the information in the show notes so people can, click the thing on there to go directly to your Instagram page.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. And that's
Hey,
how we
great.
I'm super glad that we were able to do this tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks a lot for coming on. This is definitely great. And, if you, those of you listening out there, if you like this episode and feel like it'd be helpful for someone definitely like it, subscribe, and share with someone who may benefit. And definitely tune in for future episodes.